The tractor was at her gate when she came back from the school run. It was a Tuesday morning in September of 1987, and Carol Denton had dropped her two sons at Fountain Central Elementary and driven back to her 40-acre property outside Covington, Indiana, to find a Massey Ferguson 2680 sitting at the end of her gravel drive with its front wheels in the ditch and a note tucked under the windshield wiper. The note was from Gary Pruitt, the owner of Pruitt Farm Equipment on Route 136. It said, "Carol, brought this one out. It's yours if you want it. Can't move it on the lot. Engines seized, hydraulics gone. If you don't want it, call the shop and we'll arrange to haul it off." Gary. Carol read the note twice. She was 34 years old. She had been widowed 14 months earlier when her husband Tom had died of a heart attack at 41, leaving her with two boys aged 7 and 9, 80 acres of rented farmland that she was trying In the spring of 1988, her neighbor Warren Falk, who farmed 400 acres to her north and had been one of the people who helped Carol through the first months after Tom's death in the practical, present way that farming neighbors help, by showing up with equipment when equipment was needed, asked Carol if she would be willing to service his Massey Ferguson 390 on a regular basis. Not just fix it when it broke, but maintain it. Oil changes, filter replacements, fluid checks, pre-season inspections. Warren said he trusted Carol's hands more than he trusted the dealers, and he was tired of scheduling around the dealer's availability, which was never convenient during planting or harvest. Carol asked what he had in mind. Warren said he would pay her a flat fee for the year, and she could schedule the work at times that suited her farm calendar. He said he would pay whatever she thought was fair. Carol thought about it for a day. Then she wrote a number on a piece of paper and gave it to Warren. $280 per year, covering 2 full services and 1 pre-season inspection. Warren said that was less than the dealer charged for 1 service. Carol said she knew that. Warren said he would pay more if she wanted. Carol said $280 was what the work cost her, with a reasonable return on her time, and that was what she intended to charge. Warren signed. He sent his neighbor Harold to Carol the following week. Harold signed. By the end of 1988, Carol had 6 service agreements. She had not advertised. She had not told anyone she was offering agreements. She had written a number on a piece of paper for a neighbor who asked, and the neighbor had told other neighbors, and the other neighbors had called. This was how word moved in Fountain County, through the specific channels of people who trusted each other's judgment, where a recommendation from Warren Falk was worth more than any advertisement, because Warren Falk was known to be careful about what he recommended. By the end of 1990, Carol had 23 service agreements. By the end of 1993, she had 61. She had hired her first part-time helper in 1992, a retired mechanic named Phil, who had worked at the Massey Ferguson dealer in Attica for 21 years, and who brought to Carol's shed the specific institutional knowledge of a man who had seen the same failure modes on the same models repeated across 2 decades, and knew without looking what was wrong and what the fix required. Phil worked 3 days a week. Carol paid him $40 an hour. The rate was fair, and Phil knew it was fair and did not ask for more, which Carol took as confirmation that the rate was correct. The service agreement model that Carol had built by accident in 1988 turned out to solve a problem that was larger than Warren Falk's scheduling frustration. The problem was this: the farmers in her area who ran Massey Ferguson equipment, and there were many of them because the brand had been well represented in Fountain County since the 1970s, and because the farmers who bought it tended to keep it rather than trade it on the upgrade cycles that newer brands encouraged, were maintaining their machines reactively. They fixed what broke. They serviced what demanded service. They deferred what could be deferred, because deferring was cheaper in the short term, and the short term was always the term that the farm budget was most pressured by. Reactive maintenance is more expensive than preventive maintenance across any reasonable planning horizon. Carol knew this from Tom's margin notes, and from Phil's 21 years at the dealer, and from her own 11 years of watching what broke and why. A hydraulic pump that failed because it ran low on fluid for 6 months cost more to repair than the fluid check that would have caught the level dropping. An injection pump that failed because a filter had been run past its service life cost more to replace than the filter that should have been changed 3 months earlier. The math was not complicated. The obstacle was not the math. The obstacle was the structure. Finding the time, scheduling the work, paying the bill when it arrived after a month that had already been tight. The service agreement removed the obstacle. Fixed annual fee, budgeted and paid in advance, work done on a schedule. Carol controlled at times that didn't conflict with the critical periods of the farm calendar. The farmer knew the cost before the year started. Carol knew the revenue before the year started. Both parties knew what was expected and when. The uncertainty, the breakdown during planting, The dealer visit that couldn't be scheduled for 2 weeks, the repair bill that arrived in a month when the cash wasn't there, was removed from the equation for the farmers who enrolled. Those farmers' machines lasted longer, their breakdown rates dropped, their unplanned repair costs fell. Carol tracked this because Carol tracked everything in the same notebooks she had kept since 1988, and by 1995 the data was unambiguous. A farm on a service agreement with her averaged one unplanned repair event per year per machine. A farm not on an agreement averaged 3.4. She did not publish this data. She mentioned it when asked to farmers who were considering an agreement and wanted to understand the value. The farmers who heard it understood it because they understood machinery, and they understood the cost of downtime during planting and the cost of a breakdown during harvest. And they could calculate from their own recent history what 3.4 unplanned repair events per year had cost them compared to what one would have cost. Most of them signed. By 2001, Carol Denton's service agreement base had reached 312 contracts across 7 counties. Her annual revenue was $214,000. She had 3 mechanics on staff: Phil, who was now working 4 days a week, a younger man named Steve, who had come to her shed as a customer in 1997 with a machine she repaired so correctly that he asked if she was hiring, and a woman named Janet, who had grown up on a farm in Warren County and had the mechanical instincts that farm upbringings produce in people who pay close attention to things that break and understand why. None of this had been planned. Carol had not written a business plan in 1987 or 1988 or at any point since. She had fixed a tractor because the tractor could be fixed and she could fix it. She had maintained Warren Falk's machine because Warren had asked and the work was available to her. She had written a number on a piece of paper because the number was what the work cost and a fair return on her time, and charging more than that was not something she was built to do. Everything after that had followed from those 3 decisions, as naturally as water follows a drainage grade. Not because someone designed the path, but because the path was where the conditions pointed. The 2680 that Gary Pruitt had left at her gate in 1987 was still working. It had crossed 17,000 hours in 2000. Carol had rebuilt the engine once, in 1996, when compression testing during a routine inspection showed that the time had come. The rebuild cost her $1,200 in parts and a week of her own labor. After the rebuild, the engine ran as clean as it had in 1988 when she first started it in the February cold. Gary Pruitt retired in 1999 and sold Pruitt farm equipment to a younger dealer group that rebranded and expanded and then contracted when the farm economy tightened after 2002, and the customer base that the expansion had assumed did not materialize at the assumed volume. By 2005, the successor dealership had closed its Covington location. The nearest Massey Ferguson dealer was now 41 miles away. Carol noticed this development the way she noticed everything, with attention, without comment, and with an understanding of what it meant for her business. The farms in her area that had been sending warranty work and scheduled maintenance to the dealer would now either drive 41 miles or find another option. Carol was the other option. She added 16 new service agreements in the 6 months following the Covington dealership closure. By the end of 2006, her agreement base was 593 contracts. She thought about Gary Pruitt sometimes when she was driving between farms on her service route, the truck stocked with filters and fluids and the tools for whatever the day's schedule required. She thought about the note under the windshield wiper and the question it had contained. If you don't want it, call the shop and we'll arrange to haul it off. She had not called the shop. She had kept the machine and fixed it and built something around what fixing it had taught her about what the farms in her area needed and didn't have. Gary had left the 2680 because he couldn't move it. Carol had kept it because she could see what it was worth before it was worth anything. That difference between seeing the value and not seeing it was not a difference in intelligence or information. Gary had been in the farm equipment business for 30 years. He knew Massey Ferguson machines. He had looked at the 2680 and seen an $800 loss. Carol had looked at it and seen a path. The path had taken 22 years to walk to its current point. Carol was 56 years old. She had walked it one service agreement at a time. In September of 2009, Carol Denton's service agreement base reached 847 contracts. The number arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week the 2680 had been left at her gate 22 years earlier. Carol noticed this when she updated her contract log at the end of the day. She sat with it for a moment. Then she wrote the number in the log, 847, the way she wrote every number in every log, accurately, completely, without inflation or diminishment. Her annual revenue that year was $498,000. By the time the year's final contracts were settled, it crossed $500,000. Carol noted that number too and closed the log and went to check on the 2680, which was in the shed because she had pulled it in for an oil change that afternoon. The engine ran at idle with the same even note it had been running since the February morning in 1988 when she first heard it, 22 years of correct maintenance having produced in the machine the specific mechanical character of something that has been treated well across a long time. She checked the oil, clean, at level. She checked the hydraulic fluid, full, clear. She greased the fittings. She noted the hour meter, 19,412. She shut it down. She put her tools away. She turned off the shed lights. Outside, the September fields were done for another season. The 847 farms whose machines she maintained were already thinking about fall tillage and winter preparation and what the following spring would require. Their machines were ready for whatever they decided because their machines had been maintained through the year, the way machines need to be maintained. Preventively, consistently, by someone who knew what she was doing and charged what the work was worth. Gary Pruitt had left a machine at her gate because he couldn't find a use for it. Carol Denton had found 847 uses for what fixing it had taught her. The machine was still in the shed. The number was in the log. And in the morning, there would be more work. There was always more work. That had never changed. The offer came on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2021. A man in a company truck pulled into the driveway of a farm outside Vermilion County, Illinois, got out, introduced himself as a regional acquisitions representative for a corporate agricultural management group based in Chicago, and told the farmer standing in front of him that his company was prepared to offer $2,400,000 for the land, the buildings, and the operation as a going concern. The farmer's name was Harold Fitch. He was 63 years old. He had been farming this ground for 31 years. He listened to the offer with the focused attention he gave to everything, quietly, without interrupting, letting the number land and settle before he responded to it. Then he said, "I'm not selling." The acquisitions representative said the offer was significantly above current market rate for comparable acreage in the county. Harold said he understood that. The representative said the offer had a 30-day window before it would be revised. Harold said he understood that too. The representative asked if Harold wanted to discuss the terms in more detail before making a final decision. Harold said no. The representative shook his hand, got back in his company truck, and drove away. Harold watched the truck disappear down the county road. Then he walked back to his equipment shed, where a Massey Ferguson 3070 with 14,000 hours on it was sitting with its hood open, waiting for him to finish replacing the fuel injector he'd been working on before the truck pulled in. He picked up his wrench and went back to work. Nobody who had been watching Harold Fitch's operation in 2001, when he bought that Massey Ferguson for $6,000 at a farm auction outside Danville, would have predicted the moment in the driveway 20 years later. Nobody who had seen the check he wrote that day, or heard the comments at the elevator afterward, or understood the state of his finances in the spring of 2001, would have drawn a line between that purchase and a $2.4 million offer that he turned down without sitting down. But the line was there. It had always been there. It just took 20 years to see it clearly. Harold Fitch had inherited 620 acres from his father in 1990. The land was in Vermilion County, a mix of corn and soybean ground that his father had assembled across 4 decades of careful purchasing. The inheritance came with a mortgage that had 9 years left on it, and equipment that was aging in the way equipment ages when the owner has prioritized land payments over machine upgrades. Serviceable, but showing its history. Harold was 32 years old when he took over. He had been farming alongside his father since he was 16 and had a practical education in the operation that no university program could have provided. He understood the ground, which fields held moisture, which ones drained fast, which ones needed a lighter touch with heavy equipment in a wet spring. He understood the machinery, what the sounds meant, when to push and when to back off, how to read a diesel engine the way you read a person, by what it tells you when it's under stress. What he did not have was capital. The mortgage payments consumed a significant portion of his operating income. Input costs were rising faster than commodity prices in the early 1990s, and the thin margins that had been manageable for his father's debt-free operation were less manageable for Harold's mortgaged one. He did not expand. He did not upgrade equipment. He maintained what he had with the focused attention of someone who understood that a breakdown during planting or harvest was not just a mechanical problem, it was a financial one, compounding across the days the machine sat instead of worked. By 2001, the mortgage was paid. Harold had made the final payment in December of 2000 and had stood in his kitchen afterward and done the math on what the debt elimination meant for his operating position. It meant that the fixed cost pressure that had been defining his decisions for a decade was gone. It meant he had room. Not extravagant room, but real room. The kind that lets a person make a decision that the numbers support without requiring them to borrow to support it. The Massey Ferguson 3070 appeared at an estate auction in April of 2001. It had been owned by a farmer in Edgar County who had died the previous winter. The machine had 7,800 hours on it. The paint was mostly gone. One of the rear fenders had been repaired with a piece of sheet metal that didn't quite match. The cab had a crack in the windshield that someone had sealed with silicone, but the engine ran clean. The hydraulics were strong. The transmission shifted without grinding through every gear Harold tested. The service records, bundled in an envelope that the estate had taped to the steering column, showed oil changes every 100 hours for the previous 4 years and a full hydraulic pump rebuild 18 months before the owner died. Harold walked around the machine twice. He started the engine and let it run for 10 minutes. He engaged the PTO and watched the RPM hold steady under load. He checked the dipstick twice. He looked at the service records twice. Then he found a spot near the back of the auction crowd and waited. The bidding opened at 4,000. It moved to 5 in 2 increments. Harold raised his hand at 5,000 and held it as the auctioneer worked the crowd for a competing bid. No one moved. The auctioneer dropped to $50 increments. 5,050, 5,100. At 6,000, Harold was still the only bidder. Sold. He wrote the check and drove the Massey Ferguson home on a trailer that afternoon. He parked it in the shed next to his older machines and stood looking at it for a while before going inside for dinner. His neighbor, a man named Tom Beckley, who farmed 800 acres to Harold's west and had been watching the auction from the front of the crowd, stopped by the following morning. Tom walked into the shed, looked at the Massey Ferguson, looked at Harold and said, "You paid 6,000 for that?" Harold said, "I did." Tom said, "You could have bought a decent used deer for that money." Harold said, "I looked at the deer. This one's better." Tom looked at the cracked windshield, the mismatched fender repair, the faded paint. He shook his head. He said, "You got taken, Harold." Harold said, "Time will tell." Tom drove home. Harold opened the hood of the Massey Ferguson and went back to the fuel system inspection he'd started the previous evening. The spring of 2001 was wet. Planting in Vermilion County ran 2 weeks behind schedule as rain kept fields too soft for equipment. When the ground dried enough to work, every farmer in the county was trying to get into their fields simultaneously, and the difference between operations that could push through marginal conditions and operations that had to wait was measured in planting date, which was measured in yield, which was measured in dollars at the elevator in November. Harold pushed through. The Massey Ferguson 3070 with its four-wheel drive capability handled conditions that his older two-wheel drive machines would have struggled with. He finished planting 5 days before Tom Beckley, who was running a newer but two-wheel drive John Deere as his primary tractor and had waited for drier conditions that came late. That fall, Harold's corn yielded 8 bushels per acre above the county average. Tom Beckley's came in 3 bushels below. The gap between them was partly weather, partly field position, partly soil type, but part of it, a real and measurable part, was planting date. And planting date had been determined in the wet spring of 2001 by which machine could handle the conditions. Harold didn't say anything about it at the elevator. He didn't need to. The numbers were his, and he knew what they meant. Tom Beckley bought a new John Deere 8420 in the spring of 2002. Financed over 7 years, $118,000. It was a fine machine. Nobody disputed that, and it solved the traction problem that the 2001 planting season had revealed. Tom mentioned the purchase at the co-op in a way that made clear he considered the matter of modern equipment settled. He did not mention that Harold had solved the same problem the previous year for $6,000. Harold did not mention it either. He was too busy running his operation to give much attention to his neighbor's equipment choices. He had his own numbers to manage. The years between 2001 and 2008 were, for Harold Fitch, a period of accumulation. Not dramatic accumulation. Not the aggressive expansion on borrowed capital that characterized the farm boom years for many operations, but the steady, quiet accumulation of a man who has eliminated his fixed cost burden and is now channeling the margin it created into his land and his equipment and his operating reserve. He bought 40 acres in 2003 from a retiring farmer who wanted a quick sale. He paid cash. He bought an additional 80 acres in 2005 through a private transaction with an estate. He paid cash for that too. Neither purchase was large enough to attract much attention. Together, they brought his total acreage to 740. The Massey Ferguson 3070 accumulated hours, 9,000 by 2003, 10,000 by 2005. Harold rebuilt the clutch in 2004, 2 days in the shed, parts cost $480. He replaced the radiator in 2006. He overhauled the hydraulic pump in 2007, catching wear during a pre-season inspection the way he always caught things, early enough to address them before they became failures. Tom Beckley, meanwhile, was making payments on the John Deere 8420 and had added a new planter in 2004 and a new combine in 2006. His equipment was impressive and current and financed. His operation looked, from the outside, like a successful modern farm. From the inside, it was an operation carrying the specific weight of equipment debt that requires commodity prices to stay within a range that markets do not guarantee. In 2008, the range broke. The financial crisis of 2008 hit agricultural credit the way it hit every other form of credit. Suddenly, comprehensively, and without regard for whether the individual borrower deserved the consequences. Banks that had been extending agricultural loans with relative generosity through the mid-2000s tightened their standards in ways that were felt immediately by operations carrying significant equipment debt. Tom Beckley's operating line of credit was reviewed in the spring of 2009. The bank reduced it by 30%. The reduction didn't threaten the farm's survival, but it constrained Tom's ability to cover input costs for the season without drawing on reserves he'd planned to use differently. He managed. But the management required decisions: which fields to plant at full rate, which ones to scale back, where to cut costs without cutting yield more than the cost savings justified. That Harold Fitch did not have to make that spring, because Harold Fitch had no equipment debt and a full operating line that the bank had no reason to review. Harold planted all 740 acres at full rate in 2009. He finished on time. His yields were above county average. He sold into a market that, while depressed from its 2008 highs, was still sufficient to show a positive operating margin on a farm with no fixed debt obligations. Tom Beckley had a harder year. He didn't discuss it directly, but the signs were visible to anyone paying attention. The fields that went in late, the input rates that were lower than the previous year, the combine that sat an extra week before harvest started because Tom was waiting on a parts order he'd delayed longer than he should have. Harold said nothing about any of it. He kept his operation moving and his accounting clean and his Massey Ferguson running. The machine crossed 11,000 hours in the fall of 2009. Harold noted it in his maintenance log and changed the oil. There is a specific kind of satisfaction that is available only to people who have made a decision that looked wrong to everyone around them, and then watched it turn out to be right over a long enough period that the rightness is no longer debatable. It is not a loud satisfaction. It does not announce itself. It does not require the people who thought the decision was wrong to admit they were wrong. It exists independently of their acknowledgement, as a private accounting between the person who made the decision and the consequences that followed. Harold had that satisfaction in the fall of 2009. He did not express it. He would not have known how to express it without it sounding like something other than what it was. He just kept the maintenance log and changed the oil and went back to work, the way he always went back to work, without ceremony and without the need for anyone to confirm what his own numbers were already telling him. Between 2010 and 2018, Harold Fitch's farm became, without anyone announcing it or designing it that way, one of the most financially solid operations in Vermilion County. He bought 60 acres in 2011, cash. He bought another 120 in 2014, cash from an estate sale where the heirs wanted a quick transaction, and Harold could offer one because Harold always had the reserves to move when something was priced correctly. His total acreage reached 920 by 2015, all of it owned free and clear. Tom Beckley sold 80 acres in 2013 to service equipment debt that had compounded in ways the original financing schedule hadn't anticipated. He kept farming. He remained a capable operator and a decent neighbor. But the shape of his operation had changed from the one he'd been building in 2002, and the change had been driven by the cost of the equipment he'd financed to replace the traction problem that Harold had solved in 2001 for $6,000. Harold did not say this. He did not think in those terms. He thought in terms of his own operation, his own numbers, his own ground. What his neighbors did with their finances was their business. He had his own to manage. What Harold had built by 2015 was not visible in the way that large, flashy operations are visible. He was not running the newest equipment. He was not farming the most acres in the county. He was not the name that came up first when people talked about successful farming in Vermilion County. He was the name that came up when someone asked who had been doing it the same way, correctly, for 25 years without a crisis. That distinction mattered more than it appeared to. Farming is a business where the absence of crisis is not a neutral condition. It is an active achievement, the result of decisions made correctly across years when correct decisions are not always obvious, and the pressure to make a different kind of decision is constant and comes from multiple directions at once. Banks want you to borrow more. Equipment dealers want you to upgrade. Neighbors who are expanding want validation that expansion is the right move. The market, in its good years, makes aggressive decisions look wise. Harold had resisted all of it, not from stubbornness and not from a philosophical opposition to growth, but from a clear-eyed accounting that told him every year what his operation could support without risk and what it couldn't, and a discipline that kept his actual decisions inside that line, even when the line felt conservative. The result, by 2015, was 920 acres owned free and clear, equipment that was aging but maintained to a standard that kept it reliable, an operating reserve that gave him the ability to move quickly when land came available at the right price, and a cash flow that was positive in most years and survivable in bad ones. That was what $2,400,000 was eventually going to be offered for. Not the land alone. The land was a large part of it, but not all of it. What the acquisitions representative in 2021 was pricing was the totality of what Harold had built. The land, the infrastructure, the operational history, the demonstrated productivity of a farm that had been run correctly for 3 decades. The $6,000 Massey Ferguson was not on the balance sheet, but it was in the foundation of everything that was. The Massey Ferguson 3070 crossed 13,000 hours in 2016. Harold had the engine inspected that year by a mechanic in Danville who had been working on Massey Ferguson equipment for 25 years. The mechanic pulled the valve cover, checked the rocker arms, looked at the injectors, and told Harold the engine was running cleaner than most machines he saw at half that hour count. He asked what Harold had been doing to it. Harold said he'd been changing the oil every 100 hours since the day he bought it. The mechanic said that explained it. Harold drove the tractor home and went back to work. The acquisitions representative, who came in March of 2021, had done his research. He knew Harold's acreage. He knew the land values in the county. He knew that Harold had no debt, that his operation was profitable, that the land was well maintained and productively farmed. He had built his offer around those facts and arrived at $2,400,000 as the number that should have been difficult to turn down. He had not factored in the reason Harold was still farming. Harold was not farming because he needed the money. He was not farming because he lacked other options. He was farming because the farm was what he had built, the land was what he had paid for with 30 years of correct decisions, and the operation that the acquisitions representative was offering to buy was not a financial instrument to be liquidated at optimal market timing. It was the consequence of a life run a specific way, and Harold had no interest in ending it for any number the market could produce. He turned down the offer. He went back to his fuel injector. He finished the repair that afternoon, started the engine, and listened to it run. 2 days later, Tom Beckley stopped by. He'd heard about the offer. News moves in Vermilion County the way it moves everywhere that people know each other's business. And he wanted to know if Harold had really turned it down. Harold said he had. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what that farm is worth because of how you ran it?" Harold said, "I know what it's worth." Tom said, "It started with that Massey Ferguson." Harold looked at him. Said, "I told you that you got taken when you bought it, $6,000 for that thing." I said it then and I was wrong. I've been wrong about that since 2001, and I never said it directly. I'm saying it now. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tom, you didn't need to say it. I knew what I was looking at." Tom said, "I know you did. That's the part I got wrong." He drove home. Harold walked back to the shed. The Massey Ferguson was sitting where it always sat. Hood closed now, engine cool, 14,000 hours on the meter, and a fuel injector that had been replaced that week and would not need attention again for a long time. $6,000 in April of 2001. A cracked windshield and a mismatched fender and a service record that told the truth about how the previous owner had maintained it, and a decision made at the back of an auction crowd by a man who knew what he was looking at. $2,400,000 in March of 2021. Turned down without sitting down. Because the thing that had been built across 20 years was not for sale. It had never been for sale. It had been built to last. And it had. The Massey Ferguson is still in the shed. Harold starts it every spring. The engine runs clean. The hydraulics respond. The machine does what it was purchased to do in 2001 and has been doing every season since. Nobody saw it coming. Harold saw it coming. He saw it the moment he checked the dipstick in an auction yard outside Danville and understood what the number on the service record meant and raised his hand at $6,000 while the crowd waited for someone smarter to bid. Nobody smarter bid. Harold drove it home. And 20 years later, that was still the whole story.